What was the nature of the permanent settlement? Discuss.
The permanent settlement, also known as the Permanent Settlement of Bengal, was a land revenue system introduced by the British East India Company in 1793 during Lord Cornwallis' tenure as the Governor-General of India. It primarily affected the provinces of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. The system was a key aspect of British land revenue reforms and had significant long-term effects on Indian society and economy. Nature of the permanent settlement. 1. Fixed land revenue. The most notable feature of the permanent settlement was the fixation of land revenue. The British agreed to collect a fixed amount of revenue from the landowners, zamindars, in perpetuity. This meant that regardless of any increase in agricultural production or the value of the land, the zamindars were required to pay a set amount of revenue to the British authorities. The amount was based on historical records of production, and this settlement was intended to provide a stable source of revenue for the British government. 2. Role of zamindars. The permanent settlement recognized the zamindars as the legal owners of the land. They were made responsible for collecting taxes from the peasants, ryots, who worked the land. In return, zamindars were expected to remit a fixed percentage of this revenue to the British administration. The zamindars were given significant powers over the land and its tenants, effectively making them intermediaries between the British government and the peasants. 3. Hereditary rights. Under the system, zamindars enjoyed hereditary rights over the land. They could buy, sell, or mortgage their estates, as long as they continued to meet their tax obligations to the British. If a zamindar failed to pay the fixed revenue, the British could confiscate and auction off his estate to recover the dues. 4. Peasant exploitation. The system was designed to benefit the British and the zamindars, but it severely affected the peasants. The peasants were left at the mercy of the zamindars, who often imposed exorbitant taxes and harsh conditions. Since the revenue demand was fixed, zamindars were encouraged to extract as much wealth as possible from the peasants to maximize their profits. Many peasants were forced into debt and poverty as a result of this exploitative system. 5. Limited flexibility. One of the major criticisms of the permanent settlement was its lack of flexibility. The revenue was fixed permanently, meaning that the system did not account for fluctuations in agricultural production due to factors such as natural calamities, crop failures, or economic downturns. If the crops failed, the zamindars were still required to pay the same amount of revenue, which often led to the sale of zamindari estates. Impact of the permanent settlement. 1. Increased agricultural stagnation. Since zamindars were primarily interested in maximizing their short-term profits, they invested little in agricultural development. There was no incentive for them to improve agricultural practices, irrigation systems, or infrastructure. This led to stagnation in agricultural productivity in the areas under permanent settlement. 2. Land ownership and dispossession. The system created a class of wealthy zamindars, while many peasants lost their land and became tenants or laborers. Zamindars, who often lived in urban areas, were disconnected from the actual agricultural process and cared little about the well-being of the peasants. 3. Impact on British revenues. Although the British sought to create a stable and reliable revenue system, the rigidity of the permanent settlement sometimes led to financial shortfalls. During times of agricultural distress, zamindars defaulted on their payments, leading to loss of revenue for the British government. 4. Social stratification. The system deepened social inequalities, as the zamindars gained significant wealth and power, while the peasants were increasingly marginalized. The rural economy became heavily stratified, with a small elite of landowners and a large, impoverished peasantry. In conclusion, the permanent settlement was a land revenue system that entrenched the power of zamindars and exploited the peasantry. While it provided the British with a stable source of revenue, it had negative consequences for agricultural productivity, social equity, and the well-being of the rural population. The system remained in place in Bengal until the mid-20th century, leaving a lasting legacy of rural inequality.
Discuss the differences between the moderates and extremists in the Indian National Congress.
The Indian National Congress, Inc., established in 1885, played a key role in India's struggle for independence from British rule. However, within the Inc., there emerged two distinct groups with differing approaches and ideologies, moderates and extremists. These two groups reflected the divergent views on how to deal with British colonialism and achieve self-rule. Moderates. 1. Beliefs and ideology. The moderates were the early leaders of the Congress, who believed in gradual reforms and constitutional methods to address Indian grievances. They were inspired by liberal and democratic ideals of the West and were convinced that if they presented their demands through petitions and dialogues, the British government would concede to their requests. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Pherozeshah Mehta were prominent figures of this group. 2. Approach. The moderates adopted a policy of prayer, petition, and protest. They believed in working within the framework of British law and hoped for incremental political reforms. They advocated for greater Indian representation in legislative councils, reduction in military expenditure, and improvements in the administration. Their demands were aimed at improving the condition of Indians under British rule, rather than complete independence. 3. Achievements. The moderates succeeded in creating a platform for political discourse in India. Their petitions to the British Parliament, especially the efforts of Dadabhai Naoroji, helped raise awareness about the economic exploitation of India. Dadabhai's famous drain theory highlighted how wealth was being drained from India to Britain. Although their demands were not fully met, they created a foundation for future movements and brought Indian issues into the global spotlight. 4. Limitations. The moderates were often criticized for their over-reliance on British goodwill and their limited mass appeal. They believed in elitist politics and did not involve the masses in their campaigns. Their approach, which focused on dialogue with the British, frustrated many younger nationalists who saw this as ineffective and slow in achieving meaningful change. Extremists. 1. Beliefs and ideology. The extremists emerged as a faction within the INC in the early 20th century, with leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandra Pal, also known as the Lal Bal Pal Trio. Unlike the moderates, the extremists believed in more radical and direct action to achieve self-rule, Swaraj. They argued that constitutional methods were insufficient, and that the British government would not willingly grant reforms unless pressured by forceful actions. 2. Approach. The extremists advocated for the use of mass mobilization, boycotts, and non-cooperation as means of protest against British rule. They called for a boycott of British goods, institutions, and services and urged Indians to rely on Swadeshi, indigenous goods, to hurt the British economically. They sought to arouse the patriotic spirit of the masses and believed in self-reliance and self-determination. 3. Slogan of Swaraj. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, one of the leading figures of the extremists, popularized the slogan "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." This marked a shift from the moderate demand for reform to a more assertive demand for complete self-rule. The extremists were also influenced by revolutionary ideas and were willing to consider violent means if necessary to achieve independence. 4. Differences with the moderates. While the moderates advocated for constitutional reforms through cooperation with the British, the extremists sought confrontation and direct action. The extremists criticized the moderates for being too passive and for their failure to address the demands of ordinary Indians. The split between the two groups became evident during the Surat session of the Congress in 1907, where the Congress was divided, with both groups having distinct agendas. 5. Impact. The extremists succeeded in galvanizing a sense of nationalism and brought the idea of self-rule into mainstream discourse. Their emphasis on mass mobilization and Swadeshi laid the groundwork for future mass movements, particularly those led by Mahatma Gandhi. Although their methods were seen as too radical by some, their ideas gained significant popularity among the Indian populace, particularly the youth. Conclusion. The moderates and extremists represented two different phases and ideologies within the Indian National Congress. While the moderates laid the groundwork for political dialogue and reform, the extremists radicalized the movement and brought the demand for complete independence to the forefront. Despite their differences, both factions contributed to India's eventual freedom struggle by challenging British rule in their respective ways.
What were the main ideas of the Utilitarians? Discuss.
The Utilitarians were a group of thinkers primarily based in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, who promoted the philosophy of utilitarianism. The most prominent figures associated with this movement were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Their central belief was that the moral worth of an action is determined by its contribution to overall happiness or utility. 1. Greatest happiness principle. The core idea of utilitarianism is the greatest happiness principle, which suggests that actions are morally right if they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This principle advocates for maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain as the ultimate goal of all human actions. 2. Rational and scientific approach. Utilitarians believed in using reason and evidence to determine which actions would lead to the best outcomes. They sought to apply rational methods to governance, law, and society to improve human well-being. 3. Reformist agenda. Utilitarians were reformists who believed in the necessity of political, social, and legal reforms to create a more just and equitable society. They opposed traditional privileges, advocating for equality before the law, free markets, and democratic reforms. 4. Utility in governance. Utilitarians like James Mill influenced British colonial policies, particularly in India. They supported policies that would increase utility by promoting economic growth, education, and administrative efficiency in colonies. In conclusion, utilitarianism was centered on promoting collective happiness and applying reason and evidence to achieve societal reform and justice.
Comment on the economic impact of the British rule.
The economic impact of British rule in India was profound and far-reaching, with both short-term and long-term consequences. British colonial policies fundamentally reshaped India's economic structure, often to the detriment of its indigenous industries and overall prosperity. 1. Deindustrialization. One of the most significant effects was the deindustrialization of India's traditional handicrafts and textile industries. British goods, particularly textiles, were imported into India and sold at lower prices, which led to the decline of local industries. Skilled artisans and craftsmen lost their livelihoods, and India's economy became primarily agrarian. 2. Drain of wealth. The drain of wealth theory, popularized by Dadabhai Naoroji, argued that a substantial portion of India's wealth was being siphoned off to Britain in the form of profits, salaries, and revenues. The surplus generated from India's agriculture and resources was not reinvested in India, but instead benefited Britain. 3. Agriculture and land revenue systems. British land revenue systems, such as the Permanent Settlement and the Ryotwari system, burdened Indian peasants. These systems imposed high taxes regardless of agricultural productivity, pushing many farmers into poverty and debt. British policies prioritized the production of cash crops, such as cotton and indigo, over food crops, which led to famines and food shortages. 4. Infrastructure development. While the British did build infrastructure, such as railways, ports, and telegraphs, these were primarily designed to serve British economic interests. Railways were used to transport raw materials to ports for export, rather than to benefit the local population. In conclusion, the British economic policies in India led to deindustrialization, wealth drainage, agricultural distress, and economic dependency, leaving a long-lasting negative impact on India's economy.
What was the role of the Constituent Assembly in shaping the Indian Constitution?
The Constituent Assembly played a pivotal role in shaping the Indian Constitution, which laid the foundation for India's democratic governance and legal structure. Formed in 1946, it comprised representatives from various regions, communities, and political backgrounds, ensuring a broad spectrum of ideas and perspectives. Framing fundamental rights and directive principles. The Assembly deliberated on the inclusion of fundamental rights, ensuring that the citizens of India would enjoy basic civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, equality, and protection against discrimination. Additionally, the directive principles of state policy were designed to guide the government in establishing a welfare state. Incorporating federalism, the Constituent Assembly decided on a federal structure, balancing power between the central government and state governments. This structure allowed India to function as a union of states with clear division of powers. Adoption of parliamentary democracy. The Assembly opted for a parliamentary system of government, drawing inspiration from the British model, where the executive is responsible to the legislature. Social justice. The Assembly was committed to ensuring social justice, reflected in provisions like reservation for historically disadvantaged communities, aiming to reduce social and economic inequalities. The Constituent Assembly, through debates, discussions, and compromises, successfully drafted a constitution that reflected India's aspirations, diversity, and values of justice, liberty, and equality.
Ryotwari Settlement.
The Ryotwari Settlement was a land revenue system introduced by the British in parts of southern and western India, especially in Madras and Bombay presidencies. Under this system, the individual peasant or ryot was recognized as the owner of the land, and they were directly responsible for paying taxes to the British government. The revenue was fixed based on the estimated value of the land's produce. While the system eliminated intermediaries like zamindars, it imposed heavy tax burdens on the peasants. Failure to pay taxes often led to the loss of land, pushing many farmers into debt and poverty.
State formation in Hyderabad in the 18th century.
In the 18th century, Hyderabad emerged as a powerful state under the Asaf Jahi dynasty, founded by Nizam-ul-Mulk Asaf Jahi in 1724. The decline of the Mughal Empire allowed regional powers like Hyderabad to assert their autonomy. The Nizams consolidated their rule by establishing administrative structures, building alliances, and maintaining a strong military. Hyderabad became a center of culture, trade, and political power in southern India. The state's rulers negotiated alliances with the British East India Company, ensuring the survival and prominence of Hyderabad in the Deccan despite external pressures.
The Orientalists in India.
Orientalists were a group of European scholars and administrators in India during the 18th and 19th centuries who believed in studying and preserving Indian culture, languages, and traditions. Led by figures like Sir William Jones and Henry Thomas Colebrook, the Orientalists established institutions like the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. They translated important Indian texts such as the Bhagavad Gita and Manusmriti into English, contributing to the global understanding of Indian philosophy and law. However, they were later criticized by Anglicists for focusing on traditional learning rather than promoting Western education in India.
Communalism.
Communalism refers to a political and social ideology that emphasizes religious and ethnic identities over national or secular unity, often leading to tensions and divisions within a society. In the Indian context, communalism began to rise during British colonial rule, especially with the introduction of separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims in the early 20th century. The policy of divide and rule exacerbated religious differences, fostering hostility between communities. This led to communal riots and ultimately contributed to the partition of India in 1947, which saw massive violence between Hindus and Muslims.
Transfer of power.
The transfer of power from British rule to independent India occurred on August 15, 1947. Following years of struggle led by the Indian National Congress and other nationalist movements, Britain, weakened by World War II, decided to end its colonial rule in India. The British government, through the Mountbatten Plan, facilitated the partition of India into two nations, India and Pakistan, based on religious lines. The transfer was marked by widespread communal violence, the mass migration of millions of people, and significant political and social upheaval. India emerged as a sovereign, democratic republic following this historic event.